My father gave 23 years of his life to one company. He arrived before sunrise. He stayed after everyone else had gone home. He never missed deadlines. Never complained. Never called in sick unless he physically couldn't stand. If there was a problem, everyone knew exactly who would fix it. My dad. His coworkers respected him. Customers trusted him. Even the new employees looked up to him. But there was one person who never seemed to notice. His boss. For years, Dad believed that hard work always paid off. He used to tell me, "Keep your head down. Work hard. Good people always get rewarded." I believed him. He believed it too. Until one Monday morning changed everything. It started with a company meeting. The conference room was packed. Managers stood at the front while employees waited for the yearly announcements. People whispered excitedly. Everyone expected raises. Business had been booming. The company had broken every sales record. They had just opened 2 new locations. Employees were confident that this year would finally recognize their hard work. Dad wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. He only wanted a raise that matched the extra responsibilities he'd carried for years. In fact, he had already been doing the work of 3 different employees. Whenever someone quit, their tasks quietly landed on Dad's desk. Whenever another department fell behind, Dad stepped in. Whenever management needed a problem solved, Dad stayed late. Without overtime, without complaints, without recognition. Everyone knew it. Everyone except one person. The boss. His name was Richard. Richard loved talking about teamwork. He loved posting motivational quotes around the office. Employees are our greatest asset. Together we succeed. Our people come first. The walls were covered with those slogans. Ironically, nobody believed them anymore. Because Richard had another favorite phrase. We don't have room in the budget. Yet somehow, Richard drove a brand new luxury SUV every year. He remodeled his office twice. And everyone knew he'd just bought a vacation house near the lake. Still, Dad stayed loyal. He always said, "Maybe next year." That meeting was supposed to be next year. Richard stood in front of everyone with his usual confident smile. "I want to thank every one of you." People clapped politely. "This has been the most profitable year in company history." More applause. "We couldn't have done it without your dedication." Dad smiled. Maybe this was finally it. Richard clicked to the next slide. Instead of showing raises, it showed a chart. Due to future economic uncertainty, the room immediately became quiet. "We've decided there will be no raises this year." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Richard continued speaking. "This decision wasn't easy." Of course it wasn't. "It allows us to stay financially responsible." Someone quietly laughed in the back. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Then Richard added something that made everything worse. "I know many of you were expecting salary adjustments." He looked directly at my father. "But dedication isn't about money." Dad lowered his eyes. Richard smiled again. "Real professionals work because they care." The meeting ended. Nobody celebrated. Nobody smiled. Everyone silently returned to work. Except Dad. He stayed behind. He knocked on Richard's office door. "Can I have a minute?" Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. "Sure." Dad sat down. "I wanted to ask about my raise." Richard sighed dramatically. "We already covered that." "I understand." Dad spoke calmly. "But I've taken on Mark's work after he left. And Sarah's. And most of the warehouse scheduling." Richard shrugged. "You're good at it." Dad nodded. "I appreciate that. I just think my salary should reflect the responsibilities." Richard leaned back. "You know what's funny?" Dad looked confused. "There are hundreds of people who'd love your job." Silence. "If you don't like your pay." Richard smiled. "Nobody's forcing you to stay." Dad didn't answer. Richard returned to typing. Conversation over. That evening, Dad came home earlier than usual. Mom immediately noticed something was wrong. She asked, "Bad day?" Dad forced a smile. "No." But his eyes told the truth. At dinner, nobody spoke much. I finally asked, Did the meeting go well? Dad looked at me. They said there wasn't enough money. Mom frowned. But the company made record profits. Dad nodded. They did. So what happened? Dad quietly replied, I guess I'm worth less than I thought. Those words stayed with me. Because I'd never heard my father doubt himself. Not once. Over the next few weeks, something changed. Dad still worked hard. But the excitement was gone. He stopped volunteering for extra projects. Stopped staying 3 hours late every night. Stopped fixing problems that weren't his responsibility. He simply did the job he was actually paid to do. Almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Deadlines slipped. Orders were delayed. Customers started complaining. Managers couldn't understand why everything suddenly felt chaotic. It wasn't because Dad stopped working. It was because they finally realized how much work he'd been quietly carrying all those years. One afternoon, Richard stormed into the warehouse. Why is this shipment late? Dad looked up. Scheduling didn't approve overtime. Richard frowned. You've always handled this. Dad nodded. I handled it because I stayed late. You told me overtime wasn't in the budget. Richard's face turned red. So fix it. Dad calmly replied. I finish at 5. Then he looked back at his computer. For the first time in 23 years. My father walked out exactly at 5 o'clock. Richard watched him leave. He couldn't believe it. Neither could the rest of the office. The next morning, 3 delivery trucks were waiting outside. Nothing had been prepared. Orders were missing. Inventory numbers didn't match. Phones wouldn't stop ringing. Richard spent the entire day running from department to department. He blamed everyone, except himself. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting one thing. The company had never been running because of great management. It had been running because one underpaid employee quietly held everything together. And for the first time, that employee had finally stopped doing everyone else's job. Richard still believed he could replace him. He had no idea. That decision was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. End of part 1. The following Monday started like every other Monday. Except this time, the office felt different. People whispered in the hallways. Managers walked faster. Phones rang nonstop. And Richard looked like he hadn't slept all weekend. Dad noticed the change the moment he walked through the front doors. For years, employees greeted him with smiles. Now they greeted him with questions. Did you hear what happened Friday? The warehouse is completely backed up. They're blaming operations. Richard has been in meetings all morning. Dad simply nodded. He wasn't interested in gossip. He clocked in, picked up his clipboard, and quietly started his work. Exactly the work listed in his job description. Nothing more. Nothing less. By 10 o'clock, Richard was already shouting. Everyone in the office could hear him. I don't care whose fault it is. We are losing customers. A few minutes later, the operations manager rushed over to Dad. Richard wants you in his office. Dad stood up calmly. His coworkers exchanged nervous looks. They knew what was coming. Richard didn't even invite him to sit down. We need to talk. Dad folded his hands. I'm listening. Richard forced a smile. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Dad remained silent. I know you're upset about the raise. Dad answered honestly. I'm disappointed. Richard laughed awkwardly. Come on, don't take it personally. It wasn't personal. It was business. Dad nodded. Then my decision to stop doing unpaid work is also business. Richard's smile disappeared. You know the company depends on you. Dad looked him straight in the eyes. No. The company depends on employees being willing to work for free. Silence filled the room. Richard leaned forward. People are starting to notice your attitude. Dad blinked. My attitude? Yes. You're not being a team player. Dad almost smiled. For 23 years, I skipped lunch. I worked weekends. I trained new employees. I covered vacations. I answered calls at midnight. I solved problems that weren't mine. I never asked for recognition. I only asked for fair pay. Richard crossed his arms. So you're refusing to help? Dad answered calmly. I'm refusing to work 3 jobs for 1 salary. Richard dismissed him with a wave. You can go. As Dad walked toward the door, Richard added, Don't make me regret keeping you. Dad didn't reply. The rumors started the next day. Someone claimed Dad had become lazy. Someone else said he was planning to quit. Another person whispered that management was already looking for his replacement. Dad ignored all of it. But something strange happened. The more management criticized him, the more employees realized how much he had actually been doing. One afternoon, a young employee named Ethan approached Dad. I have a question. Dad smiled. Go ahead. Were you really handling inventory, scheduling, supplier calls, training, quality checks, and customer complaints? Dad shrugged. Mostly. Ethan stared. That's 5 different jobs. Dad chuckled. I never counted. Ethan shook his head. They hired me to do one. Dad smiled politely. That's how it should be. Meanwhile, Richard had a different plan. Instead of admitting his mistake, he decided to make Dad look like the problem. At the weekly management meeting, Richard spoke confidently. Our productivity issues started when one employee stopped cooperating. Several department heads exchanged confused looks. The finance manager asked, Are you talking about Daniel? Dad's name. Richard nodded. He's refusing to help. Another manager frowned. I thought he was only doing the job he was hired for. Richard ignored the comment. We need someone with a better attitude. No one responded. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. Daniel wasn't causing the chaos. He had simply stopped hiding it. That Friday, something unexpected happened. Richard posted a job opening. Actually, 3 job openings. Warehouse coordinator, inventory specialist, operations scheduler. 3 separate positions. Employees immediately noticed. Those were the exact responsibilities Dad had been handling alone. The office exploded with whispers. Wait, so Daniel really was doing 3 jobs? I thought Richard said anyone could replace him. This doesn't make any sense. Even people from other departments began talking. Richard quickly tried to control the narrative. He gathered everyone together. We're expanding. Nobody believed him. The company wasn't expanding. It was struggling to keep up. At home, things weren't much easier. Mom noticed Dad spending more time staring out the window. One evening, she placed a cup of coffee beside him. You've been quiet. Dad smiled weakly. I'm thinking. About work. He nodded. Mom sighed. You gave them your best years. Dad looked at his hands. I keep wondering if I made a mistake. What mistake? Maybe I should have kept doing the extra work. Mom immediately shook her head. No, but everyone is angry. They're angry because they depended on your kindness. She reached across the table. Kindness should never become an obligation. Dad looked at her. She smiled softly. You didn't change. They did. Those words stayed with him. Monday morning brought another surprise. The company hired the first replacement. A young man named Kevin. Fresh out of college. Excited. Confident. Richard proudly introduced him. This is the future of the company. Kevin smiled at everyone. Dad welcomed him warmly. Nice to meet you. Kevin grinned. I've heard a lot about you. Dad laughed. I hope it was good. Kevin hesitated. Actually, Richard had already spoken to him. He said you've been refusing to help. Dad simply nodded. I see. Kevin expected an argument. Instead, Dad smiled. If you ever need advice, just ask. That confused Kevin, because it didn't match the picture Richard had painted. 3 days later, Kevin looked exhausted. He found Dad during lunch. Can I ask something? Of course. How did you keep up with all this? Dad looked surprised. Which part? Kevin laughed nervously. All of it. I've barely learned inventory. Now they're asking me to manage shipping too. And suppliers keep calling. I can't even eat lunch. Dad smiled knowingly. I used to skip lunch. Kevin stared. For 23 years? Dad nodded. Kevin looked down at his sandwich. I don't think I can do this. Dad placed a hand on his shoulder. You shouldn't have to. Kevin finally understood. The problem wasn't the employees. The problem was the expectations. By the end of Kevin's first week, he resigned. Richard was furious. "You quit already?" Kevin nodded. "This isn't one job. It's 3. Richard snapped. "Daniel handled it." Kevin answered quietly. "That's exactly why I'm leaving." Richard watched him walk away. For the first time, a small feeling of panic settled in, because replacing one loyal employee was proving much harder than he ever imagined. Kevin's resignation spread through the office before lunch. Employees weren't shocked. They were relieved, because someone had finally said out loud what everyone had been thinking for years. It wasn't one job. It never had been. Richard, however, refused to admit it. Instead, he called another emergency meeting. Everyone gathered in the conference room. Richard stood at the front with forced confidence. "I know the last few weeks have been challenging." Nobody responded. But challenges reveal character. Several employees exchanged glances. Richard continued. "Some people choose to step up." His eyes landed on Dad. "And some people choose to do the bare minimum." The room became uncomfortably quiet. Dad remained calm. He knew exactly what Richard was trying to do. If he couldn't control the workload, he would control the narrative. After the meeting, a few coworkers approached Dad. One of them, Maria, shook her head. "He's trying to make you the bad guy." Dad smiled faintly. "The people who know me don't need an explanation." "But what if corporate believes him?" Dad paused. "If they only hear one side, they might." Richard wasn't finished. Over the next few days, he started documenting every tiny mistake Dad made. If Dad clocked in 1 minute late because of traffic, Richard wrote it down. If a report was missing one signature, Richard saved a copy. If Dad took his full lunch break, Richard noticed. For 23 years, none of those things had mattered. Now they suddenly became performance issues. One afternoon, Richard called him into his office again. He slid a folder across the desk. "I've noticed a decline in your commitment." Dad opened the folder. Inside were pages of minor complaints. He looked up calmly. "Is this serious?" Richard nodded. "Very." Dad smiled slightly. "You couldn't find 23 years of mistakes, so you collected 2 weeks' worth?" Richard's face tightened. "This is your official warning." Dad signed the paper without arguing. Richard looked surprised. "That's it?" Dad stood. "I've learned something recently." "And what's that?" "You don't argue with someone who's already decided you're wrong." He walked out. Meanwhile, the company's biggest customer was growing impatient. For years, shipments had arrived early. Now they were arriving late. Orders were missing items. Invoices contained mistakes. The client requested an urgent meeting. Richard assured everyone he had things under control. He didn't. During the meeting, the customer asked a simple question. "What changed?" Richard answered without hesitation. "We've had one employee refuse to cooperate." The customer frowned. "The employee who used to handle our account?" Richard nodded. "Yes." The customer looked confused. "I've worked with Daniel for 10 years. He's always solved every problem." Richard forced a smile. People change. The customer wasn't convinced. That evening, Dad received an unexpected phone call. It was the same customer. "Daniel, I hope you don't mind me calling." Dad smiled. "Not at all. I just wanted to ask, are you leaving the company?" Dad hesitated. "No." "Why?" The customer sighed. "Because things haven't been the same. We're thinking about moving our business." Dad remained professional. "I appreciate you telling me. I hope everything works out." After hanging up, Dad sat quietly. He had every reason to tell the customer the truth, but he didn't. He refused to damage the company that had provided for his family for more than 2 decades. Even now, he still had integrity. At dinner that night, Mom noticed he was unusually quiet. "Work again?" Dad nodded. "Our biggest client may leave." Mom sighed. "They should have listened." Dad stared at his plate. "I don't want people losing their jobs." "But they blamed you." "I know. They're still blaming you." Dad smiled sadly. "I don't want revenge. I just wanted respect." The following week, Richard finally hired another replacement. Then another. 3 new employees. 1 for inventory. 1 for scheduling. 1 for warehouse operations. Richard proudly walked them around the office. This is our new team. He made sure everyone heard him. They'll help us move forward. The employees applauded politely. Dad welcomed each of them with kindness. He answered their questions, showed them around, explained the systems. Not because Richard asked, but because that was simply who he was. The new hires quickly realized something. Every process they learned had been created by Dad. Every checklist, every inventory system, every supplier contact, every emergency procedure. His fingerprints were everywhere. One afternoon, one of the new employees whispered, "Did one person really build all of this?" Maria smiled. Yes, and they never appreciated him. 3 weeks passed. Instead of improving, things became worse. The 3 new employees worked hard, very hard, but they couldn't keep up. Because each one was only learning one section of the job. Dad had mastered all of them. Richard became increasingly frustrated. Every morning started with complaints. We're behind. We missed another deadline. The warehouse is backed up. The suppliers are angry. Then came the biggest blow. The longtime customer officially ended their contract. Millions of dollars in annual business. Gone. Corporate headquarters immediately demanded answers. Executives scheduled an emergency visit. Richard panicked. For the first time, he couldn't hide the numbers. The spreadsheets told the truth. Productivity had dropped nearly 40%. Customer complaints had tripled. Overtime costs had doubled. And payroll expenses had increased dramatically. Ironically, the money Richard saved by refusing Dad's raise was now being spent on 3 salaries, overtime, recruitment costs, and lost business. The executives arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. They spent hours reviewing reports, interviewing employees, walking through the warehouse. Then one executive stopped beside Dad. "I've heard your name several times today." Dad smiled politely. "I hope that's a good thing." The executive nodded. "It depends. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Across the room, Richard watched nervously, because for the first time, someone was finally willing to listen. The executive introduced himself. "My name is Michael." He wasn't loud. He wasn't intimidating. But the moment he spoke, the entire warehouse became silent. Unlike Richard, Michael didn't interrupt people. He listened. Really listened. He spent the next 2 hours walking through every department. Instead of asking managers, he asked employees, "What slows your work down? What has changed over the last month? What would you fix first?" At first, people were nervous. No one wanted to lose their job. But one by one, they began telling the truth. Not with anger, with relief. One warehouse worker said, "Daniel used to catch mistakes before they became problems." Another employee added, "He trained almost everyone here." A customer service representative admitted, "When customers were upset, Daniel always solved it." Even the maintenance supervisor smiled. If something broke, Daniel usually fixed it before we even got there. Michael wrote everything down. He never interrupted. He simply nodded. Across the building, Richard watched every conversation. His confidence slowly disappeared. That afternoon, Michael finally sat down with Dad. They met in a small conference room. No managers. No supervisors. Just the 2 of them. Michael smiled warmly. 23 years. Dad nodded. "Yes, that's a long time." "It is." Michael folded his hands. "Tell me what happened." Dad took a deep breath. For several seconds, he said nothing. Not because he was afraid. Because he didn't want to sound bitter. Finally, he spoke. "I asked for a raise." Michael nodded. "I wasn't asking to become rich. I just wanted my salary to match my responsibilities." "What responsibilities?" Dad quietly slid a notebook across the table. Michael opened it. Every page contained handwritten notes, schedules, emergency contacts, supplier numbers, training plans. Inventory procedures. Backup systems. Maintenance logs. Everything. Michael looked up. You made all this? Dad nodded. Over the years. Michael flipped another page. Then another. Nearly every process inside the company had been created or improved by Dad. He looked genuinely surprised. You built the operating system for this entire warehouse. Dad shrugged. It made everyone's job easier. Michael asked another question. Were you paid for creating all of this? Dad smiled softly. No. Did anyone ask you to? No. So why did you do it? Dad thought for a moment. Because I cared. Silence filled the room. Michael slowly closed the notebook. Then he asked the question that changed everything. How many jobs were you actually doing? Dad laughed quietly. I honestly don't know. Michael smiled. Let's count. Together they listed every responsibility. Inventory. Scheduling. Supplier relations. Training. Quality control. Warehouse operations. Emergency planning. Customer support. Safety inspections. Software updates. Equipment maintenance. Process improvement. By the time they finished, the list covered 2 full pages. Michael leaned back in disbelief. This is impossible. Dad looked confused. What is? You were doing the work of at least 3 full-time employees. Dad simply nodded. I know. And they denied your raise? Dad looked out the window. Yes. Meanwhile, Richard was preparing his own version of events. He gathered every report he could find, highlighted every small mistake Dad had made over the previous month, printed attendance records, collected emails. His assistant looked nervous. Do you really think this is enough? Richard forced a smile. It has to be. Because deep down, he already knew he couldn't defend his biggest mistake. He had underestimated one loyal employee. The next morning, corporate called everyone into the conference room. Managers sat on one side, employees on the other. Michael stood at the front. We've completed our initial review. No one moved. We found several serious operational failures. Richard quickly spoke. As I explained yesterday. Michael raised one hand. I'm speaking. Richard immediately fell silent. Michael continued. The numbers don't support the explanation we were given. The room became even quieter. He clicked the projector. A graph appeared on the screen. Productivity. It had remained stable for years. Then suddenly, it dropped. Exactly 2 weeks after Dad stopped performing unpaid duties. Michael clicked again. Another chart appeared. Payroll costs. Instead of decreasing, they had increased by nearly 40%. Employees whispered. Michael continued. This company is now paying 3 new salaries. He paused. To replace the responsibilities previously handled by one employee. The room exploded with murmurs. Everyone looked toward Dad. Richard's face turned pale. Michael wasn't finished. Recruitment costs. Click. Training costs. Click. Overtime. Click. Lost customer contracts. Click. Every slide made the situation look worse. Finally, Michael displayed one final number. The total financial loss. It was more than 20 times the amount of the raise Dad had requested. Nobody spoke. Not even Richard. Michael turned toward him. Mr. Richardson. Richard swallowed hard. Yes. I have a simple question. Richard nodded nervously. Why was Mr. Daniels' raise denied? Richard answered confidently. Budget concerns. Michael stared at him, then quietly replied. Our financial department reviewed the budget. Another pause. There was more than enough money. Richard's heart sank. Because for the first time, his excuse had officially fallen apart. Richard forced a nervous smile. There must be some misunderstanding. Michael looked directly at him. A misunderstanding? Richard nodded quickly. Daniel never told me he was overwhelmed. Before Dad could answer, Michael opened a folder. I'd like to show everyone something. He placed several printed emails on the conference table. They were recovered from the company server. Richard's smile disappeared. Michael picked up the first email. This one was sent 18 months ago. He read aloud. Subject: Additional responsibilities. Richard, since Mark resigned, I've taken over inventory management along with my current duties. I'd like to discuss adjusting my salary to reflect the additional workload. Michael looked around the room. There was no response. He picked up another. This one is from 11 months ago. I've now taken over scheduling after Sarah left. I'm happy to help, but I don't believe this workload is sustainable for one person. Again, no response. A third email. Then a fourth. Each one was respectful, professional, never demanding, never angry. Dad had simply asked for a conversation. Richard had ignored every single message. The room was silent. Michael turned another page. There's more. This time it wasn't an email. It was an HR recommendation. The HR manager had written, Daniel's responsibilities now exceed the scope of his current position. Recommend salary review immediately. Below it, Richard had handwritten only 4 words. Not in the budget. Michael slowly placed the paper on the table. Except, he looked at the finance director sitting beside him. The budget review shows there was room. The finance director nodded. There absolutely was. We approved raises for senior management that same quarter. Several employees looked toward Richard. No one said a word. But the disappointment on their faces said everything. Richard tried one last time. Daniel never complained. Dad finally spoke. I wasn't trying to complain. I was trying to help. Richard looked desperate. You should have pushed harder. Dad smiled sadly. I thought 23 years of loyalty spoke for itself. Those words hit the room harder than anyone expected. Michael stood. I'd like to hear from the staff. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Maria stood up. I've worked here 12 years. She looked directly at the executives. If Daniel hadn't stayed late almost every night, we would have missed deadlines every single week. Another employee stood. I've only been here 4 years. I honestly thought Daniel was a manager. So did I. So did I. One by one, people stood. Not because Michael asked them to. Because they wanted to. The maintenance supervisor smiled. There were days Daniel skipped lunch just to help us. A truck driver laughed quietly. He used to answer my calls on weekends. The customer service lead added. When angry clients asked for someone they could trust, we always transferred them to Daniel. Michael looked around the room. The pattern was obvious. One person had quietly become the backbone of the company, without ever receiving the title or the pay. Then something unexpected happened. Kevin walked through the conference room door. The young employee who had resigned after 1 week. Everyone turned to look at him. Michael smiled. Thank you for coming. Kevin nodded. I wanted to tell the truth. Richard looked stunned. Kevin took a deep breath. When I accepted the job, I was told Daniel had stopped caring. He glanced toward Dad. I believed it. Dad smiled kindly. Kevin continued. After 3 days, I realized the truth. He looked directly at Richard. This wasn't one job. It wasn't even 2. I couldn't do what Daniel did. No one could. The room fell silent again. Michael thanked Kevin. Then he looked toward the 3 new employees. I have one question. Between the 3 of you, are you working full-time? All 3 nodded. Yes. And are you still struggling to keep up? Again. All 3 nodded. Michael smiled sadly. Thank you. That answer said everything. After a short break, the executives met privately. The conference room doors closed. Employees waited outside. Nobody spoke. Dad sat quietly near the window. Maria walked over. Are you nervous? Dad smiled. Not really. What do you think will happen? He shrugged. I honestly don't know. I've already accepted whatever comes. Maria looked surprised. Even after everything? Dad nodded. I can't control other people's decisions. I can only control how I respond. Nearly an hour later, the doors opened. Every employee returned to the conference room. Michael stood once again at the front. His expression was serious. We've completed our investigation. Richard shifted nervously. Michael looked directly at him. Our findings show repeated failures in leadership. He paused. Requests for fair compensation were ignored. Operational risks were overlooked. Employee concerns were dismissed. And inaccurate information was provided during this investigation. Every sentence made Richard look smaller. Finally, Michael said the words no one expected. Effective immediately. Richard is relieved of his management responsibilities pending final review. Gasps echoed through the room. Richard stood so quickly his chair fell backward. This is ridiculous. I built this department. Michael calmly replied. No. He looked toward Dad. You inherited a department that was already being held together by someone you failed to value. Richard looked around the room. He expected someone to defend him. Nobody did. Not one person. For the first time in his career, he stood completely alone. He slowly picked up his briefcase. Without another word, he walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, he stopped beside Dad. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Richard quietly said, I never thought you'd let things get this far. Dad looked at him calmly. I didn't. You did. Richard lowered his eyes. He had no answer. He simply walked away. Dad watched him leave. Not with satisfaction. Not with anger. Just with quiet acceptance. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from revenge. It comes when the truth finally has a chance to speak. The office felt strangely quiet after Richard walked out. For years, his voice had echoed through the hallways. His meetings had controlled everyone's schedules. His decisions had shaped every department. Now, the silence felt peaceful. No one celebrated. No one clapped. People simply returned to their desks. It was almost as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted. Dad quietly walked back to the warehouse. He picked up his clipboard, checked inventory, answered a supplier's phone call, and continued working, just like he always had. Except this time, everyone saw him differently. The following morning, Michael asked Dad to meet him in the executive office. Dad knocked softly. You wanted to see me? Michael smiled. Come in. There was another person sitting beside him. She introduced herself. I'm Karen, Vice President of Operations. Dad shook her hand politely. Karen smiled. We've heard a lot about you. Dad laughed quietly. I hope it wasn't all bad. It wasn't. She slid a folder across the table. We spent the entire evening reviewing your work. Dad opened the folder. Inside were copies of the systems he had built over the years. Inventory procedures, training manuals, safety programs, scheduling templates, supplier relationships. Karen looked at him. Do you know what impressed us the most? Dad shook his head. You built all of this without being asked. Dad smiled. I just wanted things to run smoothly. Karen nodded. Exactly. Michael leaned forward. We owe you an apology. Dad looked surprised. For what? For allowing this situation to continue. He paused. 23 years is too long for someone like you to go unnoticed. Dad remained silent. Michael continued. We'd like to make things right. He opened another folder. Inside was a formal offer. Dad read the first page once. Then again. He looked up. I don't understand. Karen smiled. We're creating a new position. Operations Improvement Director. Dad blinked. For me. Michael nodded. You already do the work. We're simply giving you the title, the authority, and the salary. Dad stared at the paper. The salary was almost double what he had been earning. His hands trembled slightly. Not because of the money. Because after 23 years, someone had finally noticed. Michael wasn't finished. We're also approving back pay. Dad looked confused. Back pay? Karen nodded. Our legal team reviewed your responsibilities. For years, you've been performing work well beyond your job description. We can't change the past, but we can recognize it. Dad looked down at the numbers. He couldn't speak. The amount represented years of missed opportunities. College savings. Family vacations. Home repairs they had postponed. Dreams they had quietly put on hold. He slowly closed the folder. I don't know what to say. Karen smiled warmly. Just say yes. That evening, Dad came home carrying the same old work bag he'd used for years. Mom was making dinner. She smiled. "How was your day?" Dad placed the folder on the kitchen table. "You should read this." She opened it casually. Halfway through, she stopped. Her eyes filled with tears. "No." Dad nodded. "They offered me the position." Mom covered her mouth. "And?" Dad smiled. "They're paying me what I should have earned years ago." She wrapped her arms around him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes happiness is too big for words. A few weeks later, the company felt completely different. The new management listened. Employees were encouraged to share ideas. Training programs were updated. Departments finally received enough staff. People stopped working unpaid overtime. Breaks were respected. Birthdays were celebrated. For the first time in years, employees smiled at work. Productivity slowly returned. Customers noticed the difference. One by one, the contracts came back. Even the client they had lost decided to give the company another chance. Not because of advertisements. Not because of discounts. Because they trusted Dad. One afternoon, as Dad walked through the warehouse, Kevin stopped him. "You were right." Dad smiled. "About what?" "People shouldn't have to do 3 jobs." Dad laughed. "No, they shouldn't." Kevin hesitated. "I almost gave up on this industry." "What changed?" Kevin looked around the busy warehouse. You proved good companies still exist." Dad smiled. "They only exist when good people protect them." Months passed. One rainy afternoon, Dad received an unexpected visitor. The receptionist called. "Someone's here to see you." Dad walked to the lobby. Standing there was Richard. He looked different. Older. Tired. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. He held a small envelope. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "I wanted to apologize." Dad waited. "I spent years believing loyalty was automatic. I thought hardworking people would always stay." He looked down. "I was wrong." Dad quietly nodded. Richard continued. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself." Another pause. "I've had a lot of time to think." He handed Dad the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. No excuses. No explanations. Just an honest apology. Richard looked up. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. You deserved better." Dad folded the letter carefully, then looked at him. "I accepted that a long time ago." Richard gave a small smile. "I hope someday I can become the kind of leader I should have been." Dad extended his hand. Richard looked surprised, then shook it. Not because everything had been forgotten, but because holding on to anger would never change the past. Sometimes, moving forward is the greatest victory of all. Richard quietly walked away. Dad watched him disappear into the rain. And that chapter of his life finally came to an end. That night, our family gathered for dinner. Something we hadn't done in a long time. Mom smiled across the table. "You know, I was always proud of you." Dad laughed. "I didn't need a new title to hear that." She smiled. "I know. I just thought you should hear it anyway." Dad looked around the table, then at me. "You remember what I always told you?" I smiled. "Work hard." He nodded, then added something new. "But never let anyone convince you that your hard work has no value." He leaned back in his chair. "Loyalty matters. Kindness matters. Doing your best matters. But respecting yourself." He smiled. "That matters too." Years later, people at the company still talked about the man who quietly carried an entire business on his shoulders. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed in doing the right thing. His story became part of the company's training program. New managers learned an important lesson. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never confuse loyalty with obligation. And never believe that the people who work the hardest can simply be replaced. Because sometimes, the person you overlook today is the reason your business succeeds tomorrow. And when you fail to value them, the cost is far greater than any raise you ever hope to save. Moral of the story. True leadership isn't about cutting costs at the expense of people. It's about recognizing, respecting, and rewarding those who quietly make success possible. When you value people fairly, loyalty grows. When you take them for granted, even the strongest foundation can fall apart.